Oh, I was just gonna say we should start recording. You're on it. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Can you see that? I see nods. Okay, great. So my name is Zach Sheehan. I'm the executive director here at the School Funding Fairness Project. I myself am from Concord. Actually, grew up in went through the school system here in Concord. Left for a number of years after high school. I've been back for about 7 years now. I've been at the project for about a year and a half. I'm excited to see, we do presentations. As Casey mentioned, this is kind of an abbreviated version of our kind of classic presentation that we do in communities all over the state, in person and via Zoom. And then, so we'll have some of the similar content. We made a few pieces a little more tailored for folks who are on school boards or running for school board or interested in participating more in that from a citizenry perspective. It was cool to see in the chat. We've got a small crew here tonight, but a pretty good range of people. Some involved citizens, school board members, budget administrators, a reporter from Berlin. So welcome. This is being recorded. We'll send out the slide deck after. And since it's a smaller group, feel free to kind of be jotting down any and all questions. And we'll have time to kind of go over as many as we can at the end, whether directly related to the content or tangentially related to school funding, legislation and stuff like that. This will take about 25 to 30 minutes. 30 questions in the chat. We'll get to them at the end. I might see them and grab them on the spot as well. So just, I guess, as a kind of overview for those of you who have not engaged with us before, we are a statewide organization. We're based in Concord. We've got a small staff of 4 total staff members and a very dedicated board of directors. Some of them who have been working on this issue for decades in one form or another. And a lot of what we do is educating people about school funding and property taxes and the interaction there and the ways in which we think that system's unconstitutional, how taxpayers and students are not treated fairly, and the compounding effects of this problem. And it's kind of a decades-long problem in a lot of ways. We'll be digging a little bit more in this webinar into how adequacy aid is calculated, given that that's something that I know a lot of school board members have to talk about a lot. Some of the additional aid categories that go into that. And specifically, really staying true to a lot of the work we do, we're trying to help people understand both a little more about some of those funding calculations, but also as a school board member, getting those questions when you're making really difficult decisions about potentially raising taxes, or if you're a business administrator and trying to work to, work within a really constrained budget and knowing that more money might mean higher taxes for your folks in town, how to understand that as a relationship to the lack of funding from the state. So this is a general overview of the kind of different pieces of the presentation. This will look familiar to folks that have been seeing our larger presentation recently. Some of these sections we've kind of combined or shortened up a little bit for this specific series. We like to start, though, with the constitutional principles, the kind of 2 main pieces from the Claremont decisions from the 90s that really kind of lay the foundation for a lot of the school funding pieces that we think the state is not doing in the way it should. And there's kind of 2 main principles that are the 2 sides of the coin that our organization works with. The first is that the state has this duty to pay for the cost of a constitutionally adequate education for every K through 12 student. And that constitutionally adequate, the word adequate is not the most ideal. We like to, want to have, an excellent education for our students. But the quote that goes along with this piece, the court did define adequate as expansive and future oriented, and it was not just kind of limited in the definition of what it meant to succeed or to prepare our students for whatever life path they took in the 90s. The court was saying, this needs to be going into the future as well. And then the other side of that, the other major piece out of some of those early Claremont decisions was that the taxes that the state used to pay for that constitutionally adequate education must be uniform across the state. And as we'll get into, both of these continue to not be met, in our opinion. And not just in our opinion, there's 2 current lawsuits going on that hit basically those 2 pieces and more. The first is the Conval lawsuit, which is now in year 4. They actually have their hearing coming up next month, starting in April. So that will be really interesting to watch and see some of the stuff that's said and any of the decisions from that. And they're basically arguing that the state's not giving enough money to school districts to provide that adequate education. And we'll get into kind of the specifics around that. The second suit, the Rand lawsuit, named after the first named plaintiff, a gentleman from Plymouth, is a group of taxpayers suing the state, saying that effectively, because the state relies so heavily on local property taxes to pay for public education, and those property tax rates vary all over the place, that's unconstitutional. That hearing is scheduled for October, but there's been a number of motions made and different kind of pieces, one that's actually pending right now relative to SWEPT, the statewide education property tax. We'll get a little bit more into that later, but this is also an area where people have specific questions about the lawsuits. I can do my best to answer those as well. So I'll get kind of into specifically why the reliance on local property taxes is so inequitable and kind of how that props up the system that we're talking about. So this is the most recent data. It just came out about a month and a half, 2 months ago from the Department of Education and Revenue Administration. What this shows is the total revenue that funds our school districts in the state. We spend about $3.6 billion per year on our schools, which is a lot of money. And we get largely a very good public education system out of it. Our education system does a lot of things really well. The problem here, though, from the tax perspective, is that 60%, actually 70%, if you include SWEPT, which again is that statewide education property tax. And the reason we include that as a local tax is because it's called a state tax, but the dollars never go to the state. They're raised and retained locally. The state never touches them. So it's effectively a local property tax. So 70% of all revenue for school districts in the state come from local property taxpayers. 20-ish% comes from the state. One interesting one to point out is the lottery at 4%. 4% is not nothing. It's definitely helpful, but a lot of people think that a lot more money comes from the lottery than it does. And this reliance on local property taxes for school district revenue is not a new thing, and it continues to kind of get more and more intense. Just over the past 10 years, it's increased by over $600 million. Some other aid categories all the way over on the right have actually decreased in that same amount of time. And that federal fund chunk actually got a bump in the data from this past year or two, largely due in part to some COVID money. So that was even lower before then. And in combination with other things that we use property taxes for, result in the property tax being the largest tax by far in the state. And again, this is using some even more updated data from this past year, the most recent data that was put out by the state. And what we see here is that local school tax, that $2.2 billion, and again, that SWEPT, that piece at the top there, that is technically local taxes also, is really the driving force behind our extreme reliance on property taxes, just as a state in general. An interesting thing to point out here, though, is, and this will kind of get into, a little precursor to kind of some of the stuff we'll talk about at the end, like the legislative piece, where do some of the solutions lie, is that next chart over, the business profits tax and the business enterprise tax, which are the two main business taxes in this state. And the business profits tax is largely paid by large, mostly out-of-state corporations, think your Walmarts. Those receive the bulk of the attention for potential tax relief, tax cutting in Concord, and have especially for the past 7 or 8 years. And some of the profits from those, some of the taxes, the revenue from those flow into the Education Trust Fund. As my point in saying all that is that true tax relief for more citizens of the state, including brick and mortar businesses, would be to target some of the reliance on local schools, to local property taxes that fund schools, and then a lot of the municipal and county property taxes, a big driving force behind that being the downshifting of the retirement system. Now, how do we compare to the rest of the country? I know this says FY 2020, but this is actually the most recent data, just came out last fall. It's from the Census Bureau. They're kind of like a full year-ish behind sometimes. And what this shows is that our reliance on property tax far outpaces most of the rest of the country. And the interesting thing about this is that that heavy reliance, as we'll get into a little bit, creates pretty deep disparities based on property values. Because we rely so heavily on that, not everyone feels that the same depending on how wealthy your community happens to be, or if you're next to a lake or next to a ski mountain. On the flip side, how much money our state contributes to our public education system is the lowest in the country. And I am actually just noticing that Hawaii is also marked as 21%. That's my bad. That's 21% from the previous map that got copied over here. We are, so I don't know the number off the top of my head, but 31% for New Hampshire is the lowest. And I think that's actually taking into account SWEPT. So it's giving state a little bit of credit where they may not deserve it. And this is important, right? So it's high reliance on property taxes, extreme lack of funding from the state. Both of those were kind of at the best and the worst on both of those. So how do we go about understanding why that system and how that system creates such disparities around the state, right? It's hard when we have communities like Manchester next to communities like Auburn, right? How do you compare them? Number of students, the property value, the amount of property is all very different. And so the state Department of Education uses this thing called equalized value per pupil, which is effectively think of how much taxable property is behind each student that can be taxed to support their education. Since we rely so heavily on local property taxes, this is an effective measure of basically a community's ability to raise that money. So kind of a quick thought experiment. If we have two communities, the first one has property value of $1 million, the other one has property value of $400,000. If they have the same tax rate, that tax rate per thousand, right, they're going to raise very different amounts of money. And why this matters is thinking about, what if this was a $10,000 raise to a specific teacher, for example, or a class of teachers? That $10,000, whether you're in Auburn or Manchester, still going to mean $10,000. You're fighting for the same labor force. So in order to raise that same amount, property B would need to levy a tax rate that's 2.5 times that of property A. So now you have a property value, lower property value, higher tax rate, same amount of money raised. And this wouldn't really be an issue if we didn't rely so heavily on property taxes and values to support public education, and that property value roughly matched the number of students, right? They would kind of all even out, but obviously that's not how it is. There's a lot of numbers on this chart. Again, we'll send this out after the presentation, and we use data like this a lot, so you can find it on our website as well. But what we've done here is to group a few communities together with similar student populations to try to show some comparisons there. So let's look at the under the New Hampshire one, which has those averages. Let's look at the top two there, Portsmouth and Milford. Roughly similar student sizes, 2,100 students about. And Portsmouth has almost $4 million of taxable property behind each student, that equalized value per pupil. So with the school tax rate, and that's their current school tax rate, so that's SWEPT plus local education, of about $550, they raised $21,000 per student, right? And that's just kind of simple math. And then Milford, on the other hand, has that equalized value. They only have $1 million behind each student. So about a quarter of what Portsmouth has. And their tax rate is $14 per thousand, not quite 3 times as much as Portsmouth. And yet they only raise $15,000. So triple the tax rate, but you only raise 75% of what Portsmouth does. Now look at, even a community like New London and Bristol down at the bottom there. More similar tax rates, only, $1.50 off, right? But New London, with that $5 million of equalized value, similar tax rate, raises $43,000 per student. Bristol, on the other hand, half that, still higher than average, 2.1 million, right? But is only raising $16,000 per student. And so you kind of see these higher property value can mean lower taxes and more money raised. And again, these are averages, right? These are not a perfect measure, right? Not everyone in Portsmouth is wealthy, right? Not everyone in X community, but these are averages. These show what these communities are able to do. And the kind of big takeaway from this piece is that most students, about 75%, live in the towns with below average property values. Below average equalized value per pupil. And so what that means, since we rely so heavily on property taxes, is that more students come from communities that have a tax a little higher, some a little faster, work a little harder to not quite raise the amount of their neighbors with more property value. And this can turn into, and we get criticized sometimes for, kind of bashing some of the more communities with higher property value. And not everyone who happens to live in Portsmouth is wealthy. Absolutely not, right? But with something like public education and being in such a small state, by having this system really disadvantage so many of our students, it has impacts around the state. It's not just that town. We think that public education should be available for all students, regardless of where you live. But also, it's easy to drive half an hour, you go through 10 different towns in New Hampshire. It's a small state. So to kind of bring this back from, I think Casey made a comment at the beginning, we're trying to like boil this stuff down. We always learn something, and it's get into the numbers quite a bit can get a little much, and I get that, especially on a weeknight. So to kind of bring this back to like dollars paid, let's look at some real life examples. So these are two houses. We just grabbed the pictures and descriptions from Zillow. The point here is the house on the left has a lot more square footage, amenities to it than the house on the right. But the question is, who has a larger property tax bill? Dollar amounts paid, not rates, right? Actual cash out of their pockets. And so what you see here is the house on the left's Freedom, valued over $900,000. Because they're in a community with such high property value, they can have those lower tax rates and still support what they need for their schools. Brentwood, on the other hand, much lower property values on average. So they have to have that higher tax rate. So the result is you end up paying basically the same tax bill, that school property tax bill, for two dramatically different properties. And, we use this as an example because I think it's safe to assume that the folks living in the house in Freedom have either a higher income or more, fiscal capacity than the folks living in the house in Brentwood on average, right? And we see this across the state. This one's a little less dramatic. Same idea though. One house is worth almost 400,000, the other one's worth about 200, paying just about the same amount in the property taxes. Bristol and Canaan. Same result. We see this all over the state. All right, so now we're going to get into a little bit more of kind of the, how is this, so when we say the state doesn't give enough money, how is that calculated? Why aren't they giving enough money? And actually, I'm going to go back to the slide I just saw because I want to show this one first. So what this shows is this calculated cost of adequacy, which I'll jump back to that formula in just a second, but that's the blue bar. And so this is the Department of Education, that's their term, calculated cost of adequacy. And on average, for the most recent data available, they're giving out about $4,700 per student, right? But the actual expenditures across the state are closer to $20,000 per student, right? So there's this pretty big mismatch between what the state's actually giving as their cost of education and what districts are actually spending. And so how the state calculates that adequacy is this pretty complicated formula. And effectively what it is, you start with a base dollar amount for every student, right? And it changes a little bit each year, but the newest one is $3,700 per student. And then you add on these pieces that are called differential aid. So think about them as, it is an equity-minded approach in terms of like which students need a little more funding in order to succeed at the rate of their peers. And these are the students that have been identified. So eligible for free and reduced price lunch, that's kind of like the measure of poverty that the state uses. And in general, more students who are eligible for those, so it's a certain level of the federal poverty line, in general need more resources. So the state says, okay, we'll designate more to the school for how many students you have that are eligible for that. Another $704 for students who are English language learners, which sometimes require additional services or classes. $2,000 for each student receiving special education services. And that last one there is for each third grader who's below reading proficient, because that's been identified as a marker of having a harder time keeping up in later grades, who's already not in another category. And that's that equals out on average across the state to about $4,700 per student. And again, come back to this, that mismatch between what the state says, here's our calculated cost of adequacy, and what districts are actually spending. So we did this thing, and I remember seeing someone introduce themselves as a business administrator. So if you're interested in doing this with us, we would love to participate with you as well. We actually just did this recently in Allenstown a few weeks ago. We're working with the Berlin School District to kind of redo this. And this is an exercise in the absurd. So what we did is we worked with the Pittsfield budget administrator and superintendent in the 2018-2019 budget and said, what would you need to do if you only had the number that the state, their calculated cost of adequacy at 4,700, it was closer to 4,600 a few years ago. What would you need to do? So they took their budget, a little over 10 million, passed, voter approved, worked through their school board, worked through with their district. That was about $17,700 per student. They took that budget and said, what if we only got the state's adequacy? What would we need to cut line by line to actually get there, to show like how ridiculous it would be to actually try to run a school on that amount? And they had to cut a lot. And they were doing this in mind with trying to keep the core classrooms, try to keep teachers, the basic core classrooms, students there as much as possible, try to like really, really preserve that as much as possible. And there's a lot here, and that's just the first page. All field trips are gone, all athletic programs, getting rid of some special education teachers, all travel reimbursement, all substitute teachers. Anytime a student's out or a teacher is out, no substitutes. And there's another page. So even after all of these cuts, what they got to was all those cuts resulted in class size of about 30 students per teacher, and they were still at a budget of $5.3 million. Remember that state's adequacy was 2.6. So the only thing really left was teachers. And so they cut half the teachers, and now they're about at that number. With all of those cuts, basically no maintenance, no transportation, and also now 60 students per teacher. And the business administrator might be thinking this too, most of those cuts violate state law or federal law or collective bargaining agreements. You couldn't even make them even if you wanted to for some reason, right? But the point is that you get this kind of double-edged, like the state says, here's enough money for adequacy, and the districts are spending way more. And some of the criticism sometimes is, why are you spending so much, right? And a lot of it is like good programs, good things for the students, and or federally or state mandated requirements, many of which have good reasons to support our students and make sure that everyone can have access to a good education. All right, so we're gonna do a few more funding calculations, and then we're getting to the end, so get your questions ready. And part of, so there's that first part of the formula, which is that calculated cost of an adequate education. So now I'm starting there with that 4725. And now there's additional aid categories, and these kind of come and go. They're legislative pieces that get added on. Currently, there's two. There's relief aid and extraordinary needs grants. The governor's budget just proposed kind of narrowing those down to just one. There's a bill that just passed the House last week that would add a different one. So this is kind of your different aids targeted for different reasons. Currently, the ones in there give more money to schools with higher proportions of students who qualify for free reduced lunch. So that kind of measure of poverty. Another one that the bill that just passed recently, I just mentioned, that's working through the process, would give more money to districts with low equalized value per pupil. So trying to take into account communities with lower property value, understanding that they have the harder time raising the money for schools because we rely so heavily on local property taxes, and giving them a little bit of relief. But anyway, you take that initial number, add in those additional extraordinary leads, and then you minus swept. And this is a really interesting thing that not a lot of people kind of get until you start seeing this. The state sets a rate around the state to collect SWEP, and they have to raise $363,100,000 every year, just a number pegged in statute. And so they take all the taxable property and figure out, they do some insane math and figure out how much of a rate everyone needs to levy. So then they say, okay, Derry, here's your SWEP rate. Now you tell us you raise that money. Okay, great, sounds good. But now we're going to take credit for it and take it off the top of your aid and then give you your money. So basically take credit for the SWEP that is a local property tax that you're raising, but still knock it off the top. So they add that additional aid, take off SWEP, and then they add in another category. It's called stabilization aid. And so I just went and pulled some numbers from last year from Concord for an example to kind of show you, walk it all out. So we get that total calculated cost of adequate education. Concord got about $600,000 in relief grants that year. Then minus the $7 million they raised in SWEP, which again, local property taxes. So now their grant is about 13 million. Add in about 1.8 for stabilization. So the final grant from the state says, here's the money we're giving you, about 14.7 million, which is even less than that calculated cost of an adequate education, and way less than what Concord actually needed and actually spent on their public education system that year. And part of this like SWEP piece is that's part of what's being argued in the RAND lawsuit, the taxpayer lawsuit I mentioned earlier as well. Now I can go back to these two if there are questions. Okay, a few more slides, then we'll open it up. So kind of just like two more other implications that we like to point out, both the impact on students, the amount of funding available, the impact on property taxpayers. There's some pretty clear connections to the ability of a school district and how much they can pay their teachers. Here's some data, some research done by Reaching Higher New Hampshire, education policy group based here in Concord as well, on data from last year. And they really show pretty clearly that property value in general tends to correlate with the community's ability to pay their teachers different amounts. So you can see here, just the first year teachers with a bachelor's or a master's, bachelor's in the blue, master's in the green, and see how much they vary. You know, Dover and Exeter are not that far away from each other, driving wise, right? And you could get a pretty good raise if you're able to get a job at Portsmouth versus Dover. Why wouldn't you, right? And we hear about this a lot. I was talking to someone from, Lyme, who's a more property wealthy community, and they talk about how they, every once in a while, they just kind of poach teachers from surrounding communities because they're able to pay more. And so teachers, get a few years experience in a Newport, for example, and then drive 20 minutes more and get a $10,000 raise. Why wouldn't they, right? You can't blame them for doing that, right? But it really creates another layer of the ability for schools to retain their teachers and attract them. And that has a huge impact on a student's ability to learn and grow in an environment with that type of turnover. One more piece that we like to highlight is kind of the way that the system really exacerbates tensions in regional school districts. So regional school districts are all over the state. There's a lot of different forms of them. There's a lot of communities that have their own elementary, maybe their own middle school, but then send their students to a high school, either tuitioning them in or have a regional school district where they all send their high school students to a singular school that they manage. And this is the case for the Timberland Regional School District. Now, what we did here is just kind of pull out some of the data that we've already been looking at. That equalized value for people on the left, that combined education tax rate. So again, that's the local ed and the SWEP rate. And then just basic math on what would the property tax bill be for a $300,000 home, right? And these are communities that literally neighbor each other. So some of these houses could be 100 feet apart. One happens to be in one community, one happens to be another. And what you get is, their students are going to the same high school, getting the same opportunities at that same high school, and the taxpayers are paying dramatically different rates. And this creates serious tensions. There's always conversations, legislation, proposals to communities to pull out of regional school districts because they think they're paying too much. They think they're not paying it. Like it really creates a lot of intense tensions when regional school districts are a really effective way to provide some things for a region, especially a lot of rural communities, that they might not otherwise have opportunities to. So I'm going to just give kind of a verbal explanation of a handful of current and future steps focused mostly on the legislative process. I'm happy to dig into this more if people have questions, but I want to put this slide up here because this is kind of like the problem. A lot of it stems from this excessive reliance on local property taxes combined with how little the state in the green contributes to our public education system. Just compounds a lot of these inequities around the state. So currently we're in the middle of the budget process. So the governor announced his budget about 2 weeks ago on February 14th. And in that, he made a handful of proposals that would not do a ton, not make a lot of changes to school funding. At the end of the day, they would shuffle a number of things around. That he would remove the stabilization grants, which are grants targeted largely towards communities with higher levels of need, albeit based on data from the late 2000s, so slightly outdated data, but still targets a lot of need to communities that need it the most currently. He would increase that base adequacy amount by about $1,000 per student to give a little more money to everyone. And we're still waiting for the budget bill to actually come out. It wasn't out as of about an hour and a half ago. That will kind of lay out in more explicit detail how some of the proposed changes would work. But now the House is going to get the budget. They're going to do their hearings, do a lot of work on it. It'll get changed a lot. And then it'll go to the Senate in May, and they'll do that for a month and a half. It's a pretty long process. But it also is kind of the single largest opportunity and vehicle for changes like this. There's also been a number of other smaller bills that would kind of like, do things around the edges. One specifically is House Bill 529, which is I mentioned that earlier, that would add this aid category called fiscal capacity disparity aid, which is a long way of saying give more money to communities with low property values as a recognition of the fact that we rely so heavily on those local property values. So it'd target money more towards the Manchesters, Berlins, Newports. That bill passed the House from the Education Committee, so it's now in Finance, and they'll be looking at that as part of their budget building process. I'm gonna stop there with kind of this last thought we like to land on. And I'm happy to answer questions. I'll stop sharing my screen, but I can absolutely jump back to any of the slides if people are interested, and happy to kind of stay on and answer questions.
We have questions.
Woo!
And they're really good questions so far. The first one is Janet's, but it is a one-sentence answer. Janet has asked if Governor Sununu has ever seen our presentation. I'm pretty sure the answer is no.
Yeah, I don't think so, but I'll have the caveat that I've only been here for a year and a half, so he could have before I came on, but not since I've been around.
We are working on a presentation in Warren right now, and the person that we're working on that presentation with, the principal of the Warren Village school, is inviting Governor Sununu, so he could come. Did you have something else to say, Janet?
No, I was just asking if he hasn't seen the presentation, it would be helpful if he did see it. And, it seems to me if he continues to receive invitations, that's a good thing. That's a positive.
Call him up.
I will.
Lisa has a great question, and I'm really interested in what you have to say about this, Zach. So Lisa asked, has any thought been given by our organization about the federal government suing the state of New Hampshire to fund our public schools?
That is a really interesting question that gets outside of my expertise in terms of where the federal government ends and the state government starts, and where their legal or comfort levels are in kind of dictating and managing that. I've never worked at the federal level, so it gets a little outside of my area of expertise. I would, though, pivot back to the state level lawsuits, right, where the courts have unequivocally said, you need to fund schools, the state needs to fund public education, and you have to do it using uniform tax rates. And the court saying that, and then saying, legislature, you need to do this, right? Because there's even that separation of powers where a lot of times the judicial branch is hesitant to, they're walking that line where, because the legislature does have the spending authority, right? They have the authority to raise money and spend it. And so, yeah, so I guess I would kind of, that's why a lot of the work we do is kind of like spans a lot of that. We want to support and like promote the lawsuits and make sure people understand them, but also engage in the legislative process so that people understand that it takes both, because even with court rulings, the legislature doesn't always do it. And one more thing I'll say, which I just find interesting, is, in other states, the courts have gone even further. I think it was Washington, where basically after years of this same cycle, right, court says, yes, everything's wrong, right? Please fix it. Legislature does or doesn't, and then kind of gets sued again. The court imposed a $100,000 a day fine, I think it was. And that fine then went into what would fund public schools, but that was kind of their way of trying to put teeth behind it. But it's still a touchy thing in most states, that separation there. And the federal part, yeah, I'm a little less familiar with where those lines are.
Yeah. And since our two big arguments are in our state constitution, so I don't know how the federal government would play into it necessarily.
Yeah.
And Zach, did you mention our two lawsuits already?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so Katie's question is regarding adequacy. I've read that the free lunch under the pandemic in some ways messed with the adequacy numbers. Parents maybe not applying for free and reduced lunch based on income. Could you explain? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think there's a few pieces here. I think I get what you're asking. So during the pandemic, there was a period of time where it was, I think it was called the Universal Lunch Program. So the federal government basically said, well, the pandemic really showed in a lot of ways how important schools are to a lot of pieces of a kid's life and our community's life. But a lot of kids don't get, they get their food at schools. And so recognizing that, and kind of school closures and how to make sure that they still kept getting them, the federal government, my understanding of it is that they basically said, we're waiving the need to get these forms to help provide funding for school lunches because there's a federal match. And I'll caveat this also by saying there's a group called the New Hampshire Hunger Solutions who are experts in this. So I hope I'm doing justice to this piece of work. And so they did that, which was great. But the problem is that parents then got used to not filling out that form for a year and a half. And so then when we moved away from that system, now parents need to fill out that form again so that the school can get the funding for the parents that qualify. And that's been this mismatch. And there's a bill that actually has gotten a lot of positive support, bipartisan support so far, that would solve a piece of that. I'm spacing on the number off the top of my head, but what it would do is it would take kids who are enrolled in Medicaid, right, and automatically enroll them in the free and reduced lunch program. Because if you qualify for Medicaid, you meet the same income requirements to qualify for free and reduced lunch. So the idea is you would eliminate the need for the parents to fill out that paperwork. And it would add about 6,000 kids to our free and reduced lunch program. So that's a really good idea, right, of just adding some of them. The universal lunch program, if we were just as a state to provide meals for every kid, I think it'd be about $100 million, which is both a lot of money and not, to make sure that everyone has food at schools. So I hope that was helpful. I hit your question.
Okay, I'm going to ask this next question from Brenda, and then Katie, I'll go back to the other question that you asked. So Brenda is asking, could you discuss vouchers and how they are impacted by public education and funding, and how they would be with the new bills that have been filed, if you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, so vouchers, most of the piece of vouchers is anchored to that base adequacy amount. And then there's some other pieces that change how much they get, but they are anchored to that base adequacy amount. So, for example, in Governor Sununu's proposed budget, that would raise the base adequacy amount from 37-ish hundred to 47-ish hundred. That would also raise the amount of the vouchers because they're anchored to that base adequacy amount. There are a number of bills that would do a whole variety of things in either direction to vouchers. Some would raise the income limit, so make families who make more money eligible for vouchers, which would in theory expand the number of students using them. Some would do the opposite. One that just passed the House last week and probably won't go anywhere, but is moving along in the process, would require that a student attend at least first grade of public education before getting a voucher. So they're kind of like expanding and limiting in both directions. The Department of Education has asked for $30 million a year, and Governor Sununu put that in his budget for vouchers. We're at about $15 million a year right now. So they're expecting and or working towards a significant increase in the number of students using them. An interesting thing is that most students to date so far who have used vouchers were never in public schools, or were not in public schools recently. They just took advantage of the voucher program when they were already homeschooling or in private schools, because that was not a requirement of the original bill as passed. And so those are kind of some of the specifics, but I guess kind of the larger piece is, the voucher program, part of what's challenging about it is that it's siphoning money away from a very cash-strapped system that we just spent half an hour talking about, or me talking to you about, where the state's not giving enough money to public schools. And so having money leave that system is damaging, and potentially more damaging if they are opened up more. So it's both kind of a, yes, the voucher is not the full amount of money. It's only a small amount. There's only some students leaving, but that money is sorely needed. And yeah, I guess I'll stop there. So it's kind of like a kind of policy side of it and the financial side of it. Yeah, I'll stop there and answer follow-up questions if you have. It's it's a tough subject, right? It's a very, very charged topic for sure.
Katie had one more question that I will read. Katie says, I would also love to hear your feedback on the impact of vouchers on school funding and property taxes. What particularly concerns me is the current legislation proposed to expand eligibility to any family regardless of income, as well as legislation proposed for a local voucher program, which would, the wording here is tripping me up a little bit. Do you get it?
Yeah. So the local voucher program, so two pieces. One, expanding eligibility to any family regardless of income, would make more people eligible, right? And is contrary to the way that program was initially pitched, and is generally initially pitched, which is as an opportunity for lower income students to have access to choice opportunities. There's also been results in other states that have eliminated the income requirement for vouchers, where private school tuition just goes up by the amount of the voucher, because if everyone has access to them, then they can just charge a little bit more. So it doesn't actually give people who are lower income that ability to access those opportunities as kind of pitched. The other one, the local voucher program. So what that would do, I know it's different from the bill last year, but it's similar, is it would, so right now when the voucher is roughly, I think it's about $5,000 on average, and it's roughly tied to that base adequacy amount. That local voucher would, I believe, put in the local funding as well. So if Concord's spending on average $17,000 per kid, they're getting $5,000 from the state, local property taxpayers are kicking in 12. The voucher would then be paid for the same way. The state would give 5-ish, the local taxpayers. So that'd be a lot more money coming out. I might have those details wrong because I know it's slightly different from the bill last year. But it would really make the voucher significantly more money and have more money of it coming out of the local school budget. But yeah, and again, like part of why that is challenging is because you're having a pretty finite amount of money, given how little the state contributes, going outside of our public education system, which continues to serve, you know, about 90% of all of our students. And I think that, you know, yeah, so that's part of what's another piece that's challenging about it.
All right, well, I think that is a great place to stop. Zach, would you like to tell everybody about our letter for people who are on the school board and people who are municipal elected officials?
Yeah. So, well, one thing I'll say, I'll also just, you know, re-pitch to, I think it's Heather, who's the business administrator. We're happy to do the kind of that budget exercise with you. If you think that'd be interesting, we do that with people, you know, kind of on a rolling basis. It's a helpful kind of, again, exercise in the absurd. The letter that we're helping to promote is just a letter that was done 2 years ago from local elected officials to the state legislature, kind of, you know, asking, you know, laying out this problem, asking that the legislature take a serious look at it while considering the budget. And we're helping to make sure as many people as possible see that this year as well. And I know that some of the people on the call have signed on, so I'm glad to see you here.
Yeah, and with that, we could really use help circulating it around, so if anybody would be willing to help with that, that would be awesome. And I can link to it in the materials that we send around tomorrow.
Yep. Yeah, and you know, as with always with the organization, we're always open to provide more information, point people in the right direction of resources, you know, give quotes or background to reporters or come to school board meetings. You know, really, we kind of have a very open door policy, especially with presentations like this. We present to anyone, anywhere, do our best to be there in person or virtually. And so, yeah, please stay in touch. Casey will send out a bunch of stuff as a follow-up. And we really appreciate you all spending the evening with us.
All right, thanks
both.
everyone. Thanks, Katie.
All right, have a good night, everyone.
Good night.